Ahead on Straight Talk, a setback for the LGBTQ plus community.
The High Court just now allowing a Tennessee law that bars such gender-affirming care to stand.
The Supreme Court rules on gender-affirming care.
This opens the door to set the precedent of criminalizing not only parents, but kids and physicians.
Will we see the trickle effects now into other states? And a lifeline for so many LGBTQ plus youth is going away.
I have to wonder, where will those hundreds of thousands of LGBTQ plus youth go?
The Trump administration makes a major change to the 988 suicide hotline. We look into the impact it will have here in Oregon. Hello, and thanks for joining us here on Straight Talk. I'm Stephanie Domerat. Now, this month marks 10 years since same-sex marriage became legal nationwide. It was a huge milestone for those in the LGBTQ community. But as the nation marks this month as Pride Month, there's also growing concern among LGBTQ plus advocates. And joining us to help understand the scope of these decisions is Mackenzie Dunham, a licensed clinical social worker who has a therapy practice called the Wild Heart Society in Vancouver. Mackenzie specializes in helping LGBTQ plus patients and families with an emphasis on transgender youth. Also joining us today is Blair Stenvik, the communications manager for Basic Rights Oregon, an advocacy and anti-discrimination group for people in the LGBTQ community. Blair joined Basic Rights Oregon in 2022 after a career in local journalism, writing for both Pamplin Media and the Portland Mercury. Blair, Mackenzie, thank you so much for being here today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yes, there's so many changes going on nationwide, so I want to dive right into a few of those. So just last week, the federal government instructed the National Suicide Prevention Hotline to eliminate its specialized support line for LGBTQ plus youth callers. This is the Press 3 option. So this change will go into effect July 17th. Mackenzie, I want to ask you first, what was your reaction when you heard about this?
Heartbreak. And confusion and frustration. I continue to be baffled at how an administration can target and harm such a vulnerable population. I mean, this is a community, these kids are transgender kids, overwhelmingly have struggle with suicidal ideation. And that's not because of their transness, that's because of the way that society treats them largely. And we know that one of the most protective things we can do for those kids is provide them with support and affirm who they say they are and believe them when they tell us those things. And the elimination of the Press 3 option means that when they reach out for help, they aren't necessarily going to land with somebody that understands the unique nuances of mental health or being a person who does not identify, well, let me put that in a different way, but being a person who doesn't have a place in the world where they really feel like they belong, and to call a suicide hotline and to be put in a position where that person on the other end of the phone does not understand those things and you have to educate or explain, it's really going to take away from what they really need in that moment, which is acceptance.
I want to dive into specifically the numbers that we know nationwide of people who use this service. So it started in 2022. Here's a look at the data. You can see how often it was used nationwide. Now, according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Services Administration, in January of 2025, so this year, the service fielded more than 60,000 calls. Mackenzie, you mentioned this a little. You work as a counselor with LGBTQ+, but how big of an issue really is suicidal ideation for LGBTQ+ youth?
I mean, it's huge. So over 40% of transgender youth attempt suicide.
40%?
Yeah, it's a really, really high number. And there's, and again, I just feel like it's really important to stress that the reason that that transgender kids are suicidal isn't because they're trans. It's because of the way that society treats and respects and just treats them.
And 40% is among the trans community or among the LGBT?
That's the trans community specifically.
I see.
Yeah, so it's higher in the trans community than it is in the LGBTQ plus community.
So when the federal administration announced the end of this service, a spokesperson for the White House's Office of Management and Budget called this service, quote, a chat service where children are encouraged to embrace radical gender ideology by counselors without consent or knowledge of their parents. How often do you hear this? I want to ask you both. And, what would your response be?
I hear it often. I think that there's a lot of concern about the messaging and impressionability of children, and I think that that's important. I think that we're no stranger to the way that society tries to shape children and to be a certain thing. We do it in many different parts of life, but for a counselor to push an agenda it's sort of ridiculous. That's not what counselors are supposed to do. Like by training, we're really supposed to create an open space for any person to put whatever they're dealing with on the table and help them explore it, not necessarily tell them who they are or who they are not.
Blair, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something you hear in media and from people who are maybe less informed. I think it's pretty ridiculous. I think the only ideology that a suicide hotline has is to keep people alive, not to push any sort of agenda. The same way the only agenda a doctor has is to, serve their patients and get them the best medical care. And something I've been thinking about is like Mackenzie's been so eloquent talking about the impact the loss of this hotline will have for youth, but it's really a double whammy impact because at the same time that they're defunding this, they're also putting out this statement and like doing it very pointedly. They announced this the same day that the Scrimeti decision came out, which was also, taking away healthcare for trans kids in so many states. And you can just see both the carelessness and the cruelty of this administration through that.
And speaking of that, as we mentioned, and you mentioned last week, the Supreme Court did announce their 6-3 decision to uphold a Tennessee ban on gender-affirming care for minors for people who aren't familiar. Blair, what concerns does that raise for Basic Rights Oregon, and do we expect to see trickle effects into other states?
Right. So yeah, the first thing I want to say is that decision, fortunately for Oregonians, doesn't impact our state laws. It was just saying that the bans that I think are in about 27 states now are Tennessee's ban is legal, so those bans are probably also legal. But yeah, obviously it causes concerns. We see this administration trying to just like cut back and narrow access to healthcare in so many ways. I mean, there's the Medicare bill that's likely to pass somewhat soon that would also take away Medicare funding for gender-affirming care. So it's clear they're really doing everything they can to put our community in a difficult place.
When the Supreme Court made that ruling, what were the next steps with that as far as any appeals or is there any work being done to change that ruling?
That's a great question, and it's not something that Basic Rights Oregon is aware of at this time. I think, last I heard, the national organizations that we kind of work with and speak with were still really analyzing and figuring out the best course. Really, the most important steps for Basic Rights Oregon was to connect with our community, and right now we're part of a campaign coalition that is having this week of action this week, giving people different opportunities to kind of process Scrimeti, but also act,
Yeah, does that ruling have any direct impact on Oregon's laws or any impacts here?
It does not have any impacts on Oregon, but it does just show that we can't rely on the Supreme Court to uphold, the right for people to make decisions with their families and their doctors. And so, that could certainly spell trouble with this administration or this court further down the line.
Mackenzie, what does gender-affirming care for minors entail exactly in a clinical setting? If you could explain that, and then also can you explain what this ruling means for the people that you serve?
Sure. So gender-affirming care in a clinical setting in my office is really about therapy. And for teenagers and children who have gender non-conforming identities, that's really what gender-affirming care is. It's about therapy and helping them and their families understand what's happening and creating a space to explore. A very small portion of children pursue, or by children I mean really like adolescents, pursue any sort of gender-affirming medical care, and that happens within an endocrinologist's office. It's a very specialized team and a very comprehensive team. There's psychologists, there's therapists, there's endocrinologists, there's nurses, there's a whole team of people that come together and wrap around a family to make sure that what they're doing for this kid is the right thing for this kid. And also that at any point the kid can say stop, and that's a really important part of this. But gender-affirming care is, in Oregon and Washington specifically, they both have mandates that require gender-affirming care to be a covered health benefit. So as long as those stay in place in Oregon and Washington, then those protections will remain. If the laws change in Oregon and Washington, that would be when we would start to see the effects of this bill, or of the SCOTUS decision making
An impact.
Yeah.
And could I jump in there?
Sure.
So Basic Rights Oregon is part of a coalition behind the Equal Rights for All campaign. It's a ballot measure campaign for next year for the 2026 election that would affirm the right to gender-affirming care, abortion and other reproductive rights, and marriage equality, all in the Oregon State Constitution. So, if there were a situation where laws get repealed, the Constitution is a much higher level of protection that we're working on.
Mackenzie, I want to follow up on something you mentioned. You mentioned that a very small proportion or small percentage of youth or adolescents actually undergo some sort of surgical procedure or surgery or medication. Do you think there's a misconception around that, around the numbers and what this care actually is?
Yeah, I do. And I think that there's a huge misconception. I think that people are under the impression that children start very young on a medication. And I've heard as young as 5, people have asked me about 5-year-olds or 9-year-olds. And there's the first step, if a child were to get onto a medication, is what's called a puberty blocker. And puberty blocking medication is essentially a pause button. And the whole point of the puberty blocker is to buy time. And so it pauses puberty. Everything just sort of like, just stops. And then you get time to explore things, time to grow, time to develop mentally and emotionally. And then by the time they reach the age of puberty that would be the same as their peers, that would be when they would make the next step, which isn't until 14 and a half at the earliest. And for a lot of kids, they don't start any sort of hormone care until they're 16 or 18 or even into adulthood.
What about the numbers? Do you think there's a misconception around the numbers?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that there's a belief that kids are going to say, I'm transgender, and then they're going to go to the doctor, they're going to get whatever hormones or whatever surgery that they want. There's not a wait time or anything like that, and then it's just, boom, we're changed, we're a different person.
Transgender people have become really the focus of recent political, cultural debates, it seems. From your perspective, what are some of the most harmful or widespread misconceptions you're hearing right now?
That they're not real, that it's a mental illness. I think that's a big misconception, that children are being groomed into being a different gender, which is certainly not something that you can do, and that parents are harming their children by allowing them to transition and to allowing them to be who they are. And we hear that here in Oregon and Washington, and we hear it from other states as well. And those messages still land here because people who live here have family members in other states. And so even though it's legal here and they work with their doctors and they're doing everything, they're still hearing all of that rhetoric from other states.
Blair, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Mackenzie just said. And, speaking as a trans person, I think one more kind of misconception is this idea of newness, and that this just new teenage fad, because youth finally have access to care and it's becoming more visible, which is good. But then if it's just becoming visible now, I think people who weren't tuned into that, they just assume it's something new or that it's something that really only happens in youth. When we live in Portland, there's a thriving trans and non-binary community of adults here.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back after this. Stay with us. And welcome back to Straight Talk. Thanks for joining us. We are continuing our conversation this Pride Month about recent nationwide policy changes impacting those in the LGBTQ+ community. Blair, I want to begin with you in the second half. We've seen progress in the rights, protections of LGBTQ people over the last decade, but in recent years we're seeing a change, some growing pushback. How would you describe the current state of LGBTQ+ rights here in Oregon and nationwide right now?
That's a great question. I would say, here in Oregon, we have been for a while and continue to be really one of the best states in the country for LGBTQ rights and acceptance. It's really dismaying to see how extreme some states are and, how strongly they're passing these laws targeting trans people's just ability to exist safely, really, like with restroom bans and not even to get into everything they're doing with youth. And so we're definitely doing better. I think one interesting thing is that we hear all the time about people moving from other states to Oregon, a lot of trans people, a lot of families with trans kids, both escaping kind of the discriminatory culture and the laws. And so something we've been, thinking about and focusing on is, how can we make sure that Oregon continues to be that state and that beacon and also be in a place to welcome people. And it's been really amazing to see some really grassroots efforts in the queer and trans community here in the Pacific Northwest of groups, banding together and saying, let's help find housing for these new community members. Let's help them, connect them to resources. If you go on basicrights.org, we have a pretty full resource section and some of those efforts are listed there.
Mackenzie, what are you hearing from your patients or families in light of the national changes that we're seeing?
A very large portion of the families that I work with have been talking about exit strategies and where they will need to go to and how they will know when they need to go. I've got a couple of families who have already relocated to different countries.
So when you say exit strategy, you mean leaving the U.S.?
Yeah, leaving the U.S.
How many are they?
Well, I have had 3 families that have already left. I have one family that's preparing to leave this summer, and I have a couple of families about 5 families that I'm working with right now we're just talking about different places and different strategies and where to go and doing the research.
And they live in Oregon and Washington. They don't live in other states.
That's correct. Nope, they live in Oregon and Washington. We also have had a lot of conversations about what do they do if the medications get cut off and they can't access the care that they've been receiving. How do they continue to have a person who has been on testosterone for 4 years no longer be able to access it because they're 18 and not 19. Where do they go for the medication? How do they get those things? So those are lots of conversations nobody thought they would ever have to have.
This Pride Month, June, of course being Pride Month, marks a decade since the legalization of same-sex marriage in the U.S., as we mentioned. But looking back, what's another moment or achievement that you feel stands out to you for the LGBTQ community? Blair, let's start with you.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Another achievement for the LGBTQ. I think in 2025, just the fact that we are here and continuing to impact culture so much, they can discriminate against us through politics, but still enjoy the music and the film and everything that our community really gives to the world. And just the joy of Pride festivals, and it's great in Portland, even if it's not a LGBTQ specific bar or whatever, there's still Pride stuff in so many places. That's what comes to mind right now.
What about you, Mackenzie?
I think a really significant moment was when we got to put X's on our IDs. So the X marker is a gender marker that is for non-binary folks, and to be able to put an X on your ID was a really big moment that people really felt like, look, now I can be reflected accurately. And now with recently a federal judge ruled that they can still issue them on passports. And so we'll see how long that holds, but it's a great win.
Considering policy changes we're seeing right now surrounding the community, what's next for Basic Rights Oregon? What are you guys working on the most right now?
Right, so I've talked about our ballot measure campaign for next year to affirm more rights in the Constitution. So that's a big thing we're working on. The legislative session is wrapping up right now, and something we've heard through surveying our community recently is that both like housing and like access to housing and employment discrimination are really big issues for our community here, and so we're working on getting more funding for BOLI, the state agency that processes like employment discrimination claims. We're supporting a wider coalition with the stable homes packages. That's things like rent assistance and eviction prevention. So those are a few things we're working on, and then of course it's Pride season. We're going to 15 Prides this summer,
Wow.
Engaging with over 200 volunteers, collecting signatures for that ballot measure.
Okay. Mackenzie, I want to ask you, looking forward, or even right now, when you're sitting across from these young people that you serve and that you work so closely with, what gives you the most optimism or hope?
That we can still find ways to have joy. And we're starting to really lean into joy and community building as really a really strong method of resilience and as resistance. We've been focused so much more on community care and trying really hard to connect families with other families and bring community together. Pride season is a great time for that, but really it has to persist all year round. And so we just had a couple of Pride celebrations up in Vancouver, and we're gonna have camp this summer, and we're really just trying to find ways to come together. And every time we do, it feels so good, and we're reminded that there's so many of us out there and we really aren't alone.
What would you say to people who maybe aren't, who have questions about the policy changes we're seeing, or have questions about the trans community that maybe aren't as familiar because they don't have people in their life who are trans? Like, what would you want to tell them about learning more or trying to, understand more?
Well, first I'd like to say that 80% of adults believe they've never met a trans person, which is sort of ridiculous. And so I think that the first thing is to recognize that even if you don't know that you've met a trans person, you've definitely met a trans person, and that you can't clock somebody's gender by looking at them. But then really it's about being curious and also applying a critical thinking lens when you hear things that are coming out of the Trump administration or your neighbor's mouths that just doesn't make sense, to ask like, wait, back up, hold on. Let's think about what that actually looks like. Do we actually provide medical care in school to 9-year-olds when we can't get them ibuprofen, right? We can't give them anything in school, so why would this be different? Or why do we believe that they can access medical care through this that they're just going to get it right away, but we have to jump through all these different hoops to get, insulin approved? The math doesn't make sense on so many of the things that they're accusing of this community.
Blair, what would you like to say? We only have a little bit of time left.
Oh yeah, I would just say something we know is that Oregonians really value personal freedoms, and at the end of the day, this is what it's about. And it's okay if you don't understand everything about it. You just have to extend the same freedom you want for yourself to others.
And we only have 30 seconds, but what would you want to say to someone who is in the LGBTQ community and maybe struggling today?
You're not alone. That's it.
Okay. Mackenzie, Blair, thank you so much. We are out of time for today, but I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for watching. A programming note, we will not have a show next week because of the 4th of July holiday, but we will see you back here the following week. Thanks for joining us. And a reminder, you can stream Straight Talk on your own schedule anytime. You can download the free KGW Plus app if it's available now on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.